Warning: contains adult content including harsh language, violence, and sexual themes, and may not be suitable for people under age 17.
He looked back at Mina and reached over, placing his hand on her shoulder. Without warning, she let out a cry and flung herself into his arms. Kodo was so shocked, he let himself be pushed back onto the floor. He stared at the ceiling, his arms wrapped loosely around the sobbing Mina. He didn't know what to do or say. She's too trusting, he thought wildly. She's trusting a complete stranger she found sleeping in an alley covered in blood. She's crying in my arms. She's an easy target. Kodo mouthed soundlessly, his eyes glassy, lips parted as he continued to stare at the ceiling, but not really seeing it. Mina's sobs had subsided, and she lifted her chin to look at him. "I'm so sorry," she sniffled. "It's just, I've been watching the news every day since the murders had started occurring, just to see if they caught the guy. But every time I watch, I feel so hopeless and depressed. One of the first murders that occurred in this town happened on the same street as one of my best friend's house. It's terrifying." "At least he doesn't kill animals," he said, a little too forcefully. He held his breath. He shouldn't sound so eager to praise this murderer. To his surprise, Mina smiled. "Yes," she agreed. "I am glad he doesn't do that." Kodo took advantage of this moment and sat up slightly, still holding her. "And there have been no reports on the victims being raped," he said confidently. Mina nodded, wiping her tears and smearing her makeup even more. "You're right," she said with a smile. "Homicide is a horrible thing, but in a lot of ways, rape is worse." Kodo had no idea what made him do it, but his hand jumped to her head and he began stroking her soft hair. Mina blushed, staring at him. Kodo stopped and pulled his hand back. "Sorry," he mumbled. "I just... don't cry anymore. It'll be all right." He was tired of seeing people cry. "Why do they always have to cry?" a voice in his head said savagely. "Every one of them. Why don't they just die quietly? Cowards." Kodo's expression became very sad, and Mina squeaked. "No!" she said and grasped his face in her palms, forcing him to look at her. "Don't be sad. I'll stop crying. I'll be strong if that's what you want." Kodo was taken aback. "You just met me," he reminded her. "Why does what I say matter?" Mina let her hands drop to her sides. "I don't know," she admitted. I feel I can trust you." A hot feeling erupted inside of him, and he felt like he was going to be sick. She trusts me? She trusts me? He stood, forgetting Mina was sitting on his lap as she fell back onto the floor. "Kodo, are you all right?" Kodo staggered to the bathroom and slammed the door shut, falling to his knees in front of the toilet and vomiting. Mina was pale, looking around wearily. Many things were going on inside Kodo's mind as he kneeled over the toilet. "She trusts me," said the same frantic voice. "I can't be trusted. No one should trust me. I don't deserve any kindness. I have to be alone. I must kill her!" Kodo panted, wiping his mouth and sitting against the wall, closing his eyes. "Why, though?" said the voice calmly. "Why do I feel like I can't have a friend? Maybe the problem isn't her trusting me. Maybe it's that I don't trust her. I can't trust anyone. That's how I got into all of this. I have to kill her. I can't have happiness. I don't deserve it. I must kill her. I must kill her. I must kill her!" Kodo held his head, which pounded loudly and felt hot to the touch. He stood up slowly and went back out to the living room. Mina had cleaned up everything, including the foldable table. She had laid out some blankets and pillows on top of the throw, and immediately grabbed Kodo's hand. She forced him to lay down on the bed she made for him, and felt his head. Kodo stared up into her pale face as she panicked and ran back to the kitchen. Kodo felt a little dizzy and his eyelids were heavy. He suddenly felt a cold, wet washcloth make contact with his forehead and eyelids. "Rest," Mina whispered into his ear. It felt like she was laying next to him, caressing his neck softly. I think you may have gotten sick being out there for so long, and eating so much food when you're not used to it. Do you want some tea?
No, Kodo whispered back.
Then sleep, said Mina kindly, sitting up. I want you to rest, and wake me if you need anything. Her voice faded away as Kodo drifted into a fever-induced sleep. Kodo was sitting in the grass in his backyard, petting a kitten he had found alone by a trash can on his way home from school. He was 14 and had always loved animals. However, every pet he had ever gotten had mysteriously disappeared almost as soon as he had brought them home. He smiled, his dark eyes glinting down at the now healthy, happy kitten. He had not let his parents see it, for fear that they would make him put it back outside. He had nursed it back to health for a month.
I'll keep you safe, he cooed to the kitten, who was kneading its claws into Kodo's leg. I won't let you run away like all the others did.
He didn't hear his 10-year-old sister creeping behind him. She gasped, and Kodo jumped, looking behind him. Kodo has a kitty! She explained, and turned on her heel, running back to the house. Mommy! Daddy! Kodo stood, holding the cat close to his chest. Yumi! No! He shouted, and his voice seemed to echo. He looked around frantically. Everything grew dark and gray, and he was being enveloped by thick fog. His heart began to race, panic rising inside of him. Suddenly, the kitten was lifted out of his grasp by an unseen force. Kodo watched its adorable face stare at him as it floated into the air. In a split second, the cat screamed and was ripped to shreds. Kodo screamed, pulling his hair, his face splattered with the kitten's blood, and a low, merciless laughter ringing in his ears. Kodo's eyes shot open, and he was staring at the dark ceiling. He was panting, drenched in cold sweat, but it didn't appear that he had actually screamed out loud in his sleep. He sat up, feeling the washcloth slip from the top of his head. He felt his face and concluded that the fever had gone down. He stood up and stumbled to the bathroom, weak from sleep. As he was using the bathroom, he glanced down to the knife he had placed in the crevice.
Kill her, said his thoughts. I have to. I have no choice.
He zipped up his pants as soon as he was finished, and knelt to grab the knife. He walked silently to the door to the right of the bathroom and slowly opened it. It didn't make a sound. He stared at Mina, who was sound asleep, as he inched towards her, holding up the rusty and blood-stained blade. He was standing above her, staring into her unsuspecting face, raising the knife above his head, and he stood like that for nearly a minute. Kodo began to sweat. Do it, he thought. Do it! You had no problem killing countless others. Just kill the stupid girl! Kodo slowly lowered the knife, still staring at her peaceful face. I can't, the voice said, sounding defeated. Not now, anyway. It's not the right time. With that, he retreated out of the room, put the knife back into the crevice behind the bathroom counter, crawled under the blankets on the floor, and fell asleep. Kodo woke to the sound of boiling water and someone moving about the kitchen. He sat up and looked over to see Mina making tea. She turned and jumped, smiling broadly. Good morning, she sang, and Kodo's heart spontaneously skipped a beat. How are you feeling? Better, Kodo replied. Mina smiled, handing him a cup of hot tea. Good, she said, and she truly sounded relieved. I was so worried it was something serious.
Because thoughts about killing you isn't serious,
said the voice in Kodo's head. He sipped the tea slowly, the warm liquid sliding down his throat comfortably. Mina grabbed a bag from the kitchen counter and stretched. I gotta go to work, she said. Will you be okay by yourself? Kodo stared at her.
Yes,
he said finally in an emotionless tone. Mina smiled. If you get hungry, help yourself to anything, she said. Stay out of trouble. And with that, she left. Kodo slowly walked to the window, sitting by it and watching her walk away.
10 minutes, he thought. I'll wait 10 minutes.
Kodo sat against the wall next to the window, waiting. He was itching for it, craving it. He wanted to go now. He had to wait. He couldn't risk Mina coming back and seeing him. Just then, he noticed something else on the kitchen counter. It was his clothes. Mina had apparently washed them in the morning while he was asleep. He didn't realize just how long he had slept in. "I wonder why I got sick," he muttered to himself. He checked the small clock on the wall. It had been 15 minutes already. "Oh, I'm late." He hurried to get dressed, and then went to the bathroom to grab his knife. He stuffed it in his jacket pocket. He checked his jean pockets for anything important. He found a small amount of money he found on the ground in alleys and on the streets. He thought, "Why don't I just steal the money from my victims?" He laughed to himself. "A lot of reasons. First, you'd waste the time you'd have to escape. Second, you don't need their filthy charity. You're fine on your own, alone, just how you've always been." He sighed to himself and left the apartment, walking down the street casually. It was about noon, and there seemed to be much more people on the street. He guessed that since the murders rarely occurred at night, and usually were in their own homes, it would be safest to be wandering about the city. "They're right," Kodo thought. "I wouldn't dare kill anyone out here. I'm smarter than that." The hard part was finding a house that had someone in it. He can't be seen looking into windows. He had to be decisive. How could he tell if someone was home just by looking at what's on the outside of the house? Well, for one, there might be a car parked outside. He also had pretty good hearing, so he might be able to hear the people inside. Another thing was, some stupid family may actually have their curtains wide open. If that was the case, he needed to find a house that didn't have a lot of people walking past it. He took a back road, which he knew was a quiet way to get to the high school. Since it was the afternoon, there would be no students passing by. He studied the houses with his peripheral vision. Many houses had no cars in front, and inside the houses looked dark and lifeless. A couple of these houses he had already hit, which made him chuckle to himself. At last, Kodo heard a commotion coming from a house with a silver car sitting out front. It sounded like a teenage boy was shouting at his parents, and they were shouting back. He lingered around it for a moment. "You have no idea how hard my life is," shouted a boy, who sounded no older than 15 or 16. "You can't blame me for failing all of my classes." "We know what it's like to be teenagers," screamed an older man, probably the father. "We were that age once too." The shouting continued, and Kodo slipped out of sight, sly as a fox. He was in luck. The back of the house was pretty concealed with bushes. There was a door stationed on the very low porch. "There's no way it's unlocked," he thought. He silently gave the doorknob a little twist, making sure his fingers were covered by the sleeve of his jacket. And sure enough, it was locked. He was skilled at this, however. He pulled out his knife and was able to pick the lock quickly and quietly. Kodo slid into the house, silent and stealthy. This was as easy as riding a bike to him. He stood in the hall, past the living room, where the parents stood, yelling at their son. "Getting into fights!" screamed the mother. "Getting caught with drugs! We taught you better! What happened to our sweet little Riku?" "You're not the boss of me!" bellowed Riku, red in the face. "To hell we aren't!" yelled the father just as loudly. The mother was sobbing now. "I hate you!" screamed Riku. "I hate you both! I wish you were both dead!" "That's my cue," Kodo thought to himself. He casually revealed himself, grinning. "That can be arranged," he hissed. All three of them jumped, their argument forgotten. "Who the fuck are you?" shouted the father. "Get the hell out of my house!" The mother looked pale, and the teenage boy called Riku was completely shocked into silence. Kodo tossed the knife into the air. It twirled above his head, and the family watched it in fear, seeing it almost in slow motion. Kodo caught it by the handle, and in a flash ran into the center of the three idiots staring stupidly at him, and attacked. He slit the throat of the father, plunged the blade into the mother's abdomen, and then stopped, the knife held right up to Riku's throat. They stared at each other for a minute, and neither of them seemed to be breathing. The parents spluttered on the floor, not fully dead yet. He smiled kindly at Riku. "I was like you once," he said gently. "Well, except I was a great student and never had a drug problem." He laughed at the absurdity of it all. "The point is, I hated my parents. I hated my whole family." Riku gulped and opened his mouth. What did you do?" he muttered, very frightened. Koto was sure that Riku thought he was going to spare his life, so he decided to play along. He turned to the bleeding masses on the floor, staring up at him in horror, blood trickling out of the father's mouth. "Let me show you,"